This week, you're lucky enough to have Sarah Lyall back in the captain's chair. She's here in conversation with Tana French, the great mystery and crime writer who sets most of her novels in Ireland. If you're familiar with her, it's likely for her Dublin Murder Squad series. But her new book, The Hunter, takes place outside of that series. It's a sequel to 2020's The Searcher. In the New York Times Book Review, Sadie Stein, one of the editors on staff, said, French's dialogue is some of the best in the business, and it's a delight to watch her move between American and Irish vernacular. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Sarah Lyall. It's a pleasure to welcome Tana French, who's here to talk about her latest novel, The Hunter. She's the author of 6 delicious books in a series featuring a roundelay of detectives from the fictional Dublin Murder Squad, as well as 3 standalone thrillers. The crimes in her books are almost secondary to the deep psychological mysteries at work. Hi.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me.
So nice to have you. And we're going to start with the very simplest question. Tell us about your new book.
The Hunter is set in the same imaginary town of Ardnakelty where The Searcher was. But this time, Cal Hooper, who moved there from the US when he retired as a police detective and was looking for a little bit of peace and quiet, which he didn't get. He's formed a relationship with a local woman, Lena. The two of them are raising local feral teenager Trey Reddy, turning her into a good kid, going good places. But then in the middle of a heatwave summer, Trey's absent father comes home, and he's brought with him an English millionaire and a scheme to find gold in the townland and a whole lot of trouble because he wants Trey on side. And Cal and Lena don't like that idea very much, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to protect Trey. But Trey doesn't want protection. She wants revenge.
So this is a murder mystery as well, but the murder doesn't come till I think about 2/3 of the way through the book, and it's a real shock. Tell me about your decision to organize the book that way, and what do you feel that's the fulcrum of the book? Is that murder, or is that almost beside the point in the mystery that we're unraveling here?
Yeah, that was actually something that I was a little nervous about because I was writing along and I realized, wait a minute, I don't actually need the dead body to drop in there until, as you say, 2/3 of the way through the book. And that is not standard practice for murder mysteries. You normally drop it in towards the beginning at least. But one of the things that's crucial to me about mysteries, both when I'm reading them and when I'm writing them, is that they're not necessarily about whodunit. They're not necessarily about the body. They're about the events that lead up to that moment of murder. And usually they are written the other way around, where you start with the murder and then gradually the detective teases out why it happened and how it happened and who made it happen. And I thought it could actually be all right to do it the other way around, to lead with why it happens and the events that lead up to it and the different threads that come together to make this moment. Especially in a book like this, where I didn't feel that the murder was, as you say, the heart of the book. For me, the heart of the book is the relationship between 3 people who all care a lot about each other, but their relationship is makeshift and it's being built on the fly out of what's there as they need it. And they don't necessarily know how to do this. They care a lot about each other. They're trying to do it right and they don't know how, especially when the pressure of this guy, Johnny, showing up with his schemes is brought to bear on that relationship. So I thought of that rather than the murder as the heart of the book. The murder is one of the things that happens along the way as they try to figure out how to get this relationship right. So I figured, well, if that is the heart of the book, it's okay that the murder doesn't drop in there until fairly late on.
There's so many wonderful things about this book, and I'm going to just start with Cal Hooper, who is one of your heroes. And he's a great character. He appeared in the earlier book, as you mentioned. He took early retirement from the Chicago Police Department and has settled in this rural pocket of Ireland, as you say, seeking peace and quiet. And the first book, I'd say, is in a way about his arrival in this community. And he learns how insular and suspicious it is to outsiders. And in this book, he's really entrenching himself as a member of the community. He's a fascinating character, and I wonder why you brought him back.
Yeah, I've never done that before, focused on the same character twice. But I feel like The Hunter is a very different book from The Searcher, because The Searcher was, as you say, very much about Cal. It was about that old Western trope of the stranger who rolls into the small town and maybe he's got a past and you know that he's going to be a catalyst and things are going to shift around him. But this isn't a book about one guy. The Hunter is about the three of them, Cal and Lena and Trey, and about the relationship between them, which at the beginning of the book is still quite fragile. It's developing, but it hasn't solidified yet. And so anything that disturbs it and disrupts its foundations, which Johnny's arrival definitely does, can have huge ramifications. So I did want to come back to Cal to an extent, because I think he's an interesting character for me. He's one of the few main characters I've written who are very much about action rather than introspection. He's very focused on what he does. He doesn't think that what you think matters. It's all about what you do. And because of that, I found him interesting to write. And I thought he was an interesting mix this time around with Lena and Trey, who see things very differently, especially the village itself.
Well, that's a really interesting point, in part because I think one of the main characters in the book is the village itself. And it's called, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ardnakelty. How do you say that village?
Yeah, Ardnakelty.
And it's a really interesting community. It's filled with people who've lived there for a long time. They're very secretive. They have a whole way of speaking amongst themselves that they all understand, but outsiders have a very hard time getting inside of. And you get a sense of everyone speaking around each other all the time to try to get to the truth. And I wonder where that town comes from.
Oh, the town is made up itself, but that way of speaking, it's a very Irish thing, because language is the relationship between the Irish and language. It's a complicated thing. And I don't know whether this has to do with centuries of colonization, during part of which the language was banned. But it's a very strange relationship where it is used for communication in a very oblique, very indirect way, where people tend not to say anything outright. You circle around it. You say it from different angles. You hint at it, you touch on it, and then skim away. So language isn't just a method of communication. It can also be a form of defense. And in this village, it's very much that. It's used as a form of plausible deniability, where you build up layers upon layers of words between you and the fact you're actually trying to communicate, or the thing you actually want. So that if you need to, you can just slide away from it and leave it there and say you never said any such thing. It's a very delicate tool, language, in Irish hands. And that's what I was trying to capture here, that it's used, it's a multi-tool. It's used in multiple ways, often at once. And it's very hard for somebody from a more direct culture to understand and translate what is going on at any given moment.
Well, that's one of the things that's very interesting about Cal, because he's a police officer. He's used to interrogating people. And I got the sense in many of the scenes in your book with these sorts of conversations you're describing, they were like police interrogations in a way. And I was reminded of a scene you had in one of your Dublin Murder Squad books, the last one, in which there's a really long interrogation scene between a cop and another cop, and how suspenseful it was, and how each of them is playing the other. And the question is, which one will slip first? And there's a passage where you're talking about Cal and his relationship to the people in the town. And you say, Cal has had squirrely little conversations like this with squirrely little people before, hundreds of times. Two-layer conversations where everyone knows what's going on and everyone knows that everyone knows, but they all have to keep playing dumb. And the way this plays out in this community is extraordinary. And I wondered, when you do your dialogue, how it feels like a work of art almost. How much of it comes from real conversations you've had? How much are you just winging? What's going on here? And the secondary question, is it different in rural Ireland than it is in Dublin, where you live? Is there a whole other layer of this when you get out into farm country?
I'm making almost all of it up, except for the occasional creative insult, because nobody does creative insults like the Irish. The insult is a thing of beauty around here, and it's a work of art, and it's a form of currency in which people take real pride. So that kind of thing I tend to steal. A couple of months back, I heard somebody say, him? God, he's got a face on him like a melted welly. And I was like, that is beautiful. I am stealing that. I am going to use it somehow, and I don't even know how. But apart from that, no, I'm making it up from scratch, because the heart of any interrogation scene, whether it's an official one like that one that you mentioned before, or whether it's an unofficial kind of covert one, like a lot of the ones in this book, the heart of it is that everybody concerned has an agenda, but they don't necessarily want to give it away. And the joy of this book, as opposed to the Murder Squad ones, was that if it's a police interrogation, everyone knows what the agenda is from the first moment. We all know that the detective's agenda is to find out information, and the person being interrogated's agenda is to keep that information hidden. Whereas in scenes like these ones, where it's not an official interrogation, it can be very unclear what everybody's objective is. Maybe somebody's trying to find out info but doesn't want to let that slip, and somebody wants to feed in info but doesn't necessarily want that to be overt. So that's a lot of fun. It's hiding the objectives in layer upon layer of obfuscation and distraction and misdirection. That's an awful lot of fun. But there is definitely a difference between the urban and the rural dialogue. Like urban dialogue, Dubliners talk faster, they talk snappier, they've got a flatter accent, so everything rolls along the one plane to a larger extent. I wouldn't say it's more direct, but it's definitely got more of a sharp point on it. Whereas if you go down the west, things tend to slide sideways and go in circles a lot more. There's more of an air of leisure. There's more of a sense that we can talk around this all afternoon if we need to, before we actually get anywhere near touching on the point. So it's a different rhythm. And it is one that I had to pay attention to, because my ears used to the Dublin one. I needed to slow it down and get those curves and circles in.
There's a passage that I wanted you to read, and it's so people can hear your ear for dialogue, but also get some sense of what sort of place we're talking about here. And it's a passage that we have Mart, who's one of Cal's neighbors and a very interesting character in himself. He's telling Cal about what land means to him and to the other men in the community. And there's another interesting thing here, where there's a distinction between women who've married into the community and men whose families have been there all along. And I wondered if you could read that to us, please.
Oh yeah, with pleasure. Land in Ireland, it has an emotional charge and depth that I think is hard to explain to almost anybody, and especially to farmers. So here's Mart on that subject. Mart snorts. That's not the same at all. She's a woman, and that wasn't her land, 'twas her husband's. I'd sell my own kidneys before I'd sell my family's land. My father'd come out of the grave and take the head off me. But we can go the whole year round without seeing a new face or a new place, or doing anything we haven't done all our lives. Meanwhile, we've all got brothers WhatsApping us photos of wallabies, or posting on Facebook how they're baptizing children in the jungles of Brazil. He smiles at Cal. Doesn't bother me, sure. When I get to feeling restless, I do a bit of reading about something new to keep my mind on an even keel.
Such a great passage. There's another theme in the book, another strand of dread over this community, which is climate change. And we're in the middle of something very unusual for Ireland, which is a drought. And all through this book, the drought hangs heavy over these people, because they need the rain, obviously, for their crops and to keep going. And I wonder what you were hoping to achieve with that.
Yeah, it is. It's a heat wave summer in Ardna Kelty in this book. Now, I have to say first, the heat wave needs something a little bit different over here, right? The temperatures they'd be talking about are probably low 80s, somewhere like that, which I think you guys don't even blink. But for us, that's huge. In the West in particular, where it's lush and green, the idea of weeks on end with no rain and with heat is just unthinkable. And to these guys, that's a very concrete thing. It's not like me living up in Dublin. You know, it's an excuse to take the kids down to the beach and get an ice cream, and everybody, you know, goes out and burns themselves lobster colored. For these farmers, it's a very pragmatic and immediate threat, because this does things like ruin the feed for winter, so that you're having to buy feed instead. It does things like wreck the lamb crop for next spring. So this has a concrete meaning. I wanted something that gave a sense of an unnatural atmosphere, a strange pressure in the air that wasn't right. But I also wanted something that would have an impact on the plot, which this does, because this is one of the reasons why when Johnny Reddy shows up with his scheme to find gold and then their hills, the farmers are susceptible to it because they're under threat. Their livelihoods are in danger. And so they're a lot more vulnerable to somebody with a get-rich-quick scheme than they would be otherwise. So the heat wave is kind of oppression that makes everything feel unnatural and risky, but it also drives them directly towards the end of the book.
And as you say, somewhere, I think something like heat makes people do strange things. It makes everyone crazy. And in fact, people go a bit insane in this book as the heat builds up and this scheme gets more and more elaborate.
Oh yeah, everyone's a little bit twitchy. And there's a different way that twitchiness and that slight off-balance quality can move through a small town. It's different from in a big city because everyone's so interlinked in a small town that anyone's mood or emotions or actions will have a ripple effect throughout that community. If somebody is annoyed with their husband and is in a narky mood, then he says it to somebody and somebody else hears it, and everybody, just that tension passes through the community really quickly in a way that it wouldn't in a big city.
And I love the way they all come down to the village shop to hear the gossip. But as you say, they don't directly ask for information. The way the information comes out is fascinating, and they all know how each other will tell a story. So they immediately bring layers of analysis on anything they hear because they're like, well, she won't tell it straight because she feels this about that. And so we're all working out, and they're all working out what actually happened through this strange telegraph system at the village shop.
Yeah, they're all encoded, both in the local village code and in their own personal codes and in the codes of their relationship with the person they're talking to. And they all know how to decode each other. And Carl, of course, doesn't know in the same way and is having to work out these layers of codes as he goes. I think that's one of the fascinating things about a small town setting, is that people do have not only the code, but the means to break it. And what happens when you walk in there without the means to break the codes?
We'll be right back. Hi, I'm Sarah Lyall, back here with Tana French to talk about her new novel, The Hunter. Tana, you did something quite bold after your first 6 novels. They were all in a series called the Dublin Murder Squad, and they all featured detectives. And it was a very interesting way of doing it in that you would feature different detectives in each book. So you'd have one from the previous book paired up with a new partner. And it was a great way of doing a series because you had, as you had said before, different narrators each time. Then 3 books ago, you broke from your series and have written 3 standalone novels. And I feel like it was a big moment for your readers, almost akin to when Sherlock Holmes was killed off by Arthur Conan Doyle. And everyone loves your series so much. And I'm wondering what caused you to make that change?
I wasn't comfortable with sticking to the detective's perspective anymore. From the perspective of a detective, a murder investigation is a very specific thing. It's a source of power and control. It's a way that you can retrieve order after the disruption that murder has caused. But I kept thinking there are so many other perspectives within that investigation for whom this investigation is not a source of power or control or truth and justice or whatever else. It's the opposite. It's something that just barrels into your life and upends it and can cause permanent damage, quite possibly. There are witnesses and suspects and victims and perpetrators for all of whom the investigation is, if anything, a force of chaos rather than a force of order. And I wasn't comfortable with sticking just to the detective's perspective anymore. I thought all those other ones needed and deserved some voice and some space. And so in the book after that, The Witch Elm, the narrator, Toby, he is at different times all of those things. He is a victim and a witness and a suspect and a perpetrator. And I mean, he tries to be a detective at one point, but it really does not go very well for the poor guy. And in The Searcher, Cal is a retired detective who has become very disillusioned and shaken with the job and what it makes him into. There's a line in there where he says something like he's realized that one of them, him or the job, or both, can't be trusted. And so he's tried to divest himself of everything that makes him a detective, except then when Trey shows up demanding that he should find her lost big brother, he needs to bring something of a detective back. And he's left trying to work out what is a detective with none of the trappings of being a detective, with no badge, no power, no backup, no one he can call on for help. To what extent are you still a detective? To what extent is it ingrained within him, whether he wants it or not? So I was more interested in both the searcher and the hunter in exploring a detective who doesn't want to be a detective and other people's demanding that he should be. And where is he in between those conflicting poles? Yeah, I just wasn't comfortable sticking with that perspective anymore. It felt wrong and limited and distorting.
It really takes a fascinating turn in this book because it is a previous book, your previous book's Inside Out. So you do get a detective who arrives from Dublin, and he's a good detective, but boy, no one's going to tell him anything from this community. And watching from their perspective as they all obfuscate with him, don't tell him the whole story, withhold things on purpose, is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I enjoyed writing him because I wanted him to be basically a decent detective doing his best on a difficult case, but from the perspective of everybody in the village. And at this point, that actually includes Cal. He's definitely not this kind of force for truth and justice. He's an annoyance and an obstacle. And he is also at sometimes a useful tool to get the job done that they want done. And so they use him and twist him to their own end. And I liked writing a detective from that opposing perspective, that, yeah, as you call it, inside out perspective.
So if you look at a book like, I'm trying to think of a classic murder mystery where many people had a motive to kill the victim, let's say Murder on the Orient Express, and you learn after the murder how many people wanted the victim dead. And as you say, the rest of the book is an effort to tease out all those different motives. In this book, by the time this person dies, we, the reader, practically would have killed them ourselves. It's so obvious why this person deserves to be a corpse. But we don't know. It takes a long time for us to learn who the murderer is. And indeed, I don't want to give too much away, but the way the community all has an understanding of this and the way that information is or is not telegraphed to the outside world is part of what's interesting about this. Before you wrote the book, did you plot out the whole thing and know exactly what was going to happen to who, or did it present itself along the way?
Oh God, no, I never plot it all out in advance. I never have a clue who did what to whom when I start. I think I blame this on having come from an acting background. So for me, everything's about character. And in order to figure out the actions, I have to get to know the characters by writing them for a while before I can know who would do what and for what reason. So I wasn't even sure who was going to get killed this time. I thought it could be one of two people. And as I was writing along, I realized which one it had to be. And I kept going. And it took me quite a long while to figure out who had actually done it. Because as you say, this is somebody who definitely could do with killing from multiple standpoints. So it took me a while to figure out who would actually have taken that leap and why to kill him. But I know I don't plot ahead. I kind of envy writers who do, because at least when they start, right, if they've got an outline, they know there's a book there. They know that all the loose ends are going to come together and the threads will, in fact, add up to a coherent plot. And I don't know that. I just have to wing it and hope and do a lot of rewriting as I figure stuff out.
So wait, so you killed off this person and you yourself didn't know who the murderer was going to be?
No, I thought again that it could be one of two or three people actually in that case. And I was going, maybe it's something. But it's funny how as you keep writing and you keep writing people's responses to the murder and how they deal with the detective, and suddenly it becomes clear, oh, of course, the person who would have seen this as the inevitable and necessary step, that's who it is. It's like a Polaroid, develops little bit by little bit.
So as you're writing, do the characters tell you what they want to do next as you go? I mean, you allow them to tease out themselves as you're writing?
kind of like that. You're playing with a scene. I'll know, oh, well, so-and-so needs to talk to so-and-so about this thing because they would go to them to discuss this. And just playing with the dialogue in your head and just feeling what lines would be nice for that character to say. And usually there's something in there that'll just nudge the plot along or nudge the relationship along. And that gives you the next step. So it is very one step at a time. Just see where the characters take themselves. Sometimes it's completely unexpected. Like Mart, I threw into The Searcher because I wanted someone who was fun to write, and which he really is. He's fun to write. And I really value the Irish sense of humor with all its darkness and all its eloquence. And I wanted some way to bring that in. I thought that's a gorgeous thing and should be in the book. But I didn't really see Mart when I started writing him as somebody who would be core to the plot and the relationships. And yet that's who he turned out to be. I suddenly woke up halfway through and went, oh man, no, he's more important than I thought.
Well, also Cal feels the same way. Cal tries to keep him at a distance and then realizes that he needs him for various things. And we need him as readers. And when you talk about sense of humor, there's a great scene later in the book where all the men are down the pub and they're celebrating something that's happened. I'm not going to give it away. And there's a whole thing where all the local Irish men are filling Cal full of these sort of folk rituals that they say he now has to go through and what he has to do and what he has to do. And then he gives them back some American ones. And then they all realize they're all kidding.
Yeah.
It's so great because also it's a moment, I think, where he becomes part of the community. He suddenly understands how to do this in a way that he hadn't before. And they finally accept him. And it's really nice.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, he clicks into the rhythms. And there is a rhythm to the Irish pub and the Irish slagging, which is like a core intrinsic part of the culture. And it's a way that people show affection. Men in particular, Irish men, show affection and acceptance by giving each other hassle. I remember going down to the pub, right, with my boyfriend at the time, now my husband, and all his friends, and bringing with me my Italian cousin, who was overstaying with me for a few days, right? And we went down there, and my Italian cousin, he's pretty fluent, but it took him a while to adapt to the Dublin accent. And we were just hanging out, and my boyfriend and his friends were all slagging the absolute hell out of each other. And my cousin finally turned to me and said in Italian, but Tana, do these people hate each other? Like, this means I love you, man. This is how they do it, by ripping the absolute heck out of each other.
It feels very male. Do you, as a woman, when you go to a pub, feel like you're one of the guys? Is it possible to be one of the guys as a woman, or is it something really male and women more or less stay away?
I think overall, it's mainly an all-male thing, but I do have specific friends with whom I have that kind of slagging back and forth relationship. One of my dearest friends, we see each other walk into something we're doing together and go, oh, God, he's back. Why did you get her in here again?
So we at the office are always so excited when you have a new book out, and we all fight over the reader's copies. I think there was only 2 of these that our editors got, and we were all basically grabbing them out of each other's hands. And whenever one of these new books comes out, I'm always a little sad when I start it because I know there won't be another one for a couple of years, maybe.
I know.
What are you working on now? Can you tell us anything about it? When is it coming out? How soon can I read it?
Okay, this is weird because I thought The Searcher, in terms of Ardna Kelty, I was going to be one and done. But then I just felt like there was more in it when it came to The Hunter, because I really loved the sort of weird genre intersection that I'd found, which is kind of mystery software running on Western hardware almost. And I liked that. I went back for more. And now it turns out it seems to be 3 books, not 1, not 2. Because I felt like the way I was playing with the idea of mapping Western tropes onto the West of Ireland setting started an arc where in The Searcher, I'm dealing with the outsider and his relationship with a small town. And The Hunter is all characters who exist on a periphery between insider and outsider for different reasons and from different perspectives. Like Cal, it's because he's an American who's moved here and started to build a life. And Lena, it's because she's deliberately distanced herself from the townland. And Trey, it's because she's Ardna Kelty born and bred, but she's from that family who the townland basically thinks are a lot more hassle than they're worth. So everybody in The Hunter is in this strange limbo between insider and outsider. And I thought, well, I've dealt with two perspectives here. Shouldn't that arc be finished off with dealing with the stories and the secrets of insiders and what it means to be an insider here and how one navigates that in this small town that is so jam-packed with stories and secrets and threads that can be tugged at any time by the rest of the community. So I seem to be writing that book now.
Will you be writing from the perspective of other members of the community in the town?
So far, no. So far, it is Lena and Cal this time only, not Trey, but who are navigating a deeper relationship with the townland than they necessarily either of them ever planned or wanted, but it seems to be demanded now.
How far along are you?
Not very, and not as far along as I'd like to be, but I'm getting there. Slowly unpicking it and figuring out what comes next.
Well, can you write a little faster, please? Can you read this interview and go back to your typewriter immediately?
More coffee.
You were an actor before you started writing, and your first book, In the Woods, I think was written when you were in between jobs, or did you actually have a job at the time, an acting job? Tell us about the massive change in career from acting to writing.
Well, it came out of a career gap, because I was always in theatre. And if you're in theatre, unless you were Judi Dench, which I was definitely not, the gigs don't line up neatly. There's always a gap in between. And from a child, I'd always been fascinated by archaeology. So when I had a gap there of, I think, a month it was, I went and found myself a gig on an archaeological dig, just doing the grunt work. I don't know what I'm doing. So they gave me a mattock and a wheelbarrow and went, over there, dig, don't ruin anything. And I loved it. But there was a wood near the dig. And I was looking at it one day going, that would be a wonderful place for kids to play. And then instead of stopping there like a normal person would, I did the mystery writer thing of trying to find the mystery in everything. And I thought, what if 3 kids ran in there to play and only one came out and he had no memory of what had happened to the others? What would that do to his mind? Knowing that he had the solution to this mystery somewhere inside himself and he couldn't put his finger on it. And what if he became a detective and a murder case brought him back to that wood? So I gradually realized that I really wanted to know the rest of this story and that nobody else was going to write it for me. Now, I had done a load of writing short stories as a kid, as a teenager. Writing was always something that I'd been very passionate about and worked really hard on. But I couldn't sidetrack by acting. So when I got engaged with this idea, I didn't figure I could write a book. I had never tried to write a full book before, but I figured I could probably write one scene and then another scene, and then I had a chapter. And then one day I realized that I had just turned down a really nice show in order to finish this book. And actors, you know that they do not turn down acting work. And that was the moment when I went, oh man, I'm actually really invested in this. And in some ways it wasn't as much of a leap as you'd think, because if you're writing first person, which is what I did for most of my books up until the last couple, it's close to acting, where what you're doing is you're aiming to create a really detailed 3-dimensional character and then draw your audience in so that they see the world of the play or the book through this character's needs and biases and fears, and they come out feeling like they know this character intimately as they'd know their best friend. So it's not actually too big of a leap.
When you were writing In the Woods, did you have an expectation that it would be published? How did you go about getting it published?
I really hoped it would get published. I really did. But I, again, hadn't tried this before, so I didn't know. So when I was about 4 chapters in, I'm lucky enough to know an editor in an Irish publishing house. And I sent her those 4 chapters. I said, look, this is not me putting any professional pressure on you. I'm really sorry, but if you have a moment, could you just have a read and just tell me, should I keep going with this? Or should I throw it under my bed and go, let's never speak of this again? And she went, no, keep going. So from there, she sent it to someone she knew, and then they came back going, we'd actually like to make you an offer on this, at which point I took a while to pick my jaw up off the floor and went, I need an agent. And the agent I ended up with, Darley Anderson, is pure magic. The man is a magician. But I was very lucky in that I was steered towards him by an editor who was interested in the book, and also that it happened to land on his desk at the right time. Because there are so many people out there who don't have that luck of being pointed towards the right person at the right time and don't end up with a magician like Darley Anderson. And from there, it's all been very wonderful and very strange.
My memory, and tell me if I'm getting this right, the character in the woods who comes out alive, my memory is that he was wearing sneakers that were filled with someone else's blood. Is that right? He had bloody shoes with someone else's blood in them. And it's one of the weirdest things about the mystery of what happened to him. And it reminded me a lot of The Secret History, where, if I'm also getting this right, one of the characters comes in out of a crazy experience with someone else's blood in her hair, and no one ever figures out whose blood it is. Is The Secret History one of your inspirations? What other books do you like to read? What sort of mysteries do you yourself turn to as a consumer?
The Secret History is absolutely, it was formative, I think, for me and for probably quite a number of mystery writers of my generation, for a couple of reasons. One of them being, it is a mystery, but it's also a wonderful literary novel. And Donna Tartt absolutely refuses to be limited in any way by the boundaries of the mystery genre. She's very aware of them. She clearly knows them inside out. But to her, they're not limitations. They're an interesting starting point. Like, she starts the first page of The Secret History by telling you who killed whom. That is not your standard mystery procedure. And then she uses all the genre boundaries as something that can be stretched, used as a springboard, turned inside out, tied in a knot, used as a flourish. It was just an amazing experience to read, to go, this is the mysteries that I've known and loved, taken suddenly to a four-dimensional place. So that was huge. I think for me and a lot of others, that moment of reading, we don't need to be limited in any way by the genre boundaries. And also, the way that she refuses to be limited by anybody's perceptions of either literary fiction or genre fiction. Because there still is, less so now than when she started out, but there still is this perception that literary fiction has great writing, wonderful characterization, thematic depth, probably not a lot of plot. While genre fiction has a gripping plot, but maybe workmanlike writing, 2D characters, not a lot of thematic depth. And there is no way that Donna Tartt is having any truck with any of that. She is doing it all. She has the plot that you just can't even breathe, never mind put it down, and the character depth, and the beautiful lyrical writing, and so much thematic depth that I wouldn't even know where to start. So she's not accepting this idea of or. She's demanding and doing all of it. And I think those are the writers who, both in literary fiction and in mystery, mean a lot to me. Like, if you take Dennis Lehane, he's another one. Mystic River was another of those books that was absolutely formative because it is a gripping mystery, but it's a wonderful social history. It's beautifully atmospheric. It's got so much going on. And these are the ones that refuse to be bounded by the rules of the genre, and the ones that refuse to see the genre as a limitation in any way. Those are the ones that I love.
And finally, I feel like each of your books has a kind of theme behind it that's, or a point you're trying to make that's separate from the mystery itself. And I'm just thinking back. I mean, one book you wrote really was a State of Ireland novel about the financial crash and the effect that had on the society. Another one was about friendship and how close friendship can go awry. There was one about one of your characters goes back to his childhood and sort of solves a mystery within the family that also reverberates back on him. And I wonder, with these books, was there a thought behind this that's sort of similar, that you wanted to make greater points beyond just a portrait of a small town and the secrets it holds?
It's usually not deliberate what the thematic underpinning ends up being in any book. Definitely in Broken Harbour, which has that kind of state of the nation feel, that definitely wasn't deliberate. It was just that this sense of almost national madness and national breakdown was so all around me that it seeped into the book without me ever intending to or really wanting to write about it. In The Searcher, what I was really thinking about was morality, which is a big deal in the Westerns I've been reading. They're very much books about good and bad, but without a message. without any moral finger wagging. They just lay out the fact that good and bad are complicated. There are shades of grey. Good people do bad things. Bad people can do good things. And sometimes you find yourself in a situation where there doesn't seem to be a good solution, a good thing to do, no matter how hard you try. And Westerns, I think, are very matter of fact about that. They don't try to prescribe any moral framework. They just show characters trying to hold to that in the face of events that don't always make it easy, and sometimes succeeding, but sometimes failing. So I was thinking a lot about that with The Searcher. And in this one, while that was one of the things I was thinking about, I was thinking more about the idea of constructed family, not the family you're born with, but the family that you make for yourself, which Cal and Lena and Trey are doing, not necessarily deliberately, but because that's what they found along the way. And also about the idea of revenge and about what happens when those two things conflict. What do you sacrifice when you're desperate for revenge, but you have these people there who mean so much to you and you can't have both? So I was thinking about that tension a lot with this one.
Is there one book that you go back to and read over and over again that's your sort of comfort book, or the book that you most just love to turn to in your life?
I think weirdly, the book that I've reread most times is definitely Watership Down by Richard Adams. Because I read it the first time I would have been, I think, 7. And I don't think it's a kid's book at all. But, it's about rabbits. So a lot of people assume that it must be. And my parents gave it to me because I think we were on a long car drive for a family holiday. And I was the kind of kid who, if you give her a long book, she's basically out of your hair until she's finished it. She is completely absorbed and can be ticked off the list. So I disappeared into Watership Down and loved it. I reckon I probably maybe understood, a third of it, half of it. Definitely not a lot of the kind of political nuance. That would have gone straight over my head. But every time I've come back to it since, I've found something new in it. The writing is just exquisite on a sentence-to-sentence level. The atmosphere, there are still scenes in that book that make the hair go up on the back of my neck. The characters, they're rabbits, but they're really real. And the way he constructs their world is amazing, where they're not anthropomorphic. Their way of seeing the world is entirely different from the human way, the way they evaluate things and the way they understand everything about the world is just different. And I think that may have been the first book that got me onto the idea that your perspective is not the default one, that it's possible for a book to portray a different viewpoint in a way that sucks you in so that you come out of it seeing the world differently for that moment. And I read it again and realized that there are social and political metaphors or analogies or whatever going on there. And every time I read it, I love it for all the old reasons and I find something else new. So that's the one I go back to most.
Fantastic. Tana French, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was delightful to talk to you.
Sarah, thank you so much for having me and for all these interesting questions. I feel like I'm smarter now than I was an hour ago for talking about all that stuff. Thank you.
That was Sarah Lyall in conversation with Tana French about her new book, The Hunter. I'm Gilbert Cruz. This is the Book Review Podcast, and thank you so much for listening.